magic of playing guitar, and oh, to be young again and truly feel it. Now I can think back of my time being a young kid, right? And getting a new guitar or getting a new amp, and the feeling of magic and turning it on, and turning those knobs and hearing that sound come out of that amplifier, and what magic it possessed, and the feeling of having that new amp, right? Maybe having your first half stack, right? And taking it out on a gig, feeling that much power behind you and dialing in the knobs so that you could get feedback when you wanted it, and hitting that note, being able to raise your hand and let that note, and you could have that forever note. Imagine if you could stand there in that moment of glory, holding that note with your fist, in the air, and the glory of that. Don't we all wish that moment could last forever? I think back of my time going to Berklee College of Music. I hadn't even been out of high school yet. It was a summer program, and I learned so much at that school, right? But there was this one kid, right? And he seemed to have the whole rock and roll business, under his fingertips. He had the hair, he had the look, he had a Charvel guitar, which I hadn't even seen in person yet. He had a Floyd Rose, he had all of those things, right? And there was one amp at that school that everybody coveted at that music store across the street. The music store was Daddy's Junky Music. It was a pretty friggin' epic guitar shop, man. I know a lot of people that watch this channel are familiar with that shop, but man, they had everything, man. They had vintage Gibsons. And back then, dude, it was nothing to buy a vintage Gibson Les Paul for $500, but man, I can remember doing a deal there, and it was a mess, right? I had a mid-70s Les Paul Custom, right? But they had this double neck guitar on the wall, cherry red like that. It looked exactly like Jimmy Page's 12-6, right? And I thought, man, what amazing music I could create on this double neck. And it had a 12 string and a 6 string. And I had $500 in my pocket, and I had the Les Paul, and they had $1,000 on the price. Imagine that. This was probably about 1982. This was probably a late 60s or early 70s 12-6 Gibson double neck guitar, exactly like Jimmy Page's. And I saw that guitar out, that $500 in my pocket, and that Les Paul, and I thought, man, I can trade that. My Les Paul's worth $500 because that's what I paid for it, and it was used when I bought it. And I had that $500, and I thought, man, I'm gonna get that double neck, right? So I traded. I got that double neck, and it's a story I've covered on this channel, but when I called home and told him about the double neck, man, my mom hit the roof, and she called the store and then called me and said, you go back down there. They're going to give you your Les Paul back. You get your guitar back, and but they wouldn't give the $500 back, right? They gave me a store credit. So at the end of my time at Berklee College of Music, it was a summer program. It might have been only a month long. And when I came back up, it was basically said, okay, you got the $500 credit, and it's your birthday. Pick out something you want. And I think it was, had a $1,000 limit, right? So, I mean, I couldn't even believe that this was happening. right? But maybe, my mom was in a good mood. I don't know. But it was literally like, there was one amp at that store that everybody in that, everybody at Berkeley, every kid coveted. It was the Mesa Boogie SOB. It was a blonde white amp with the metal grill cloth, and it had gain for days. It had 3 knobs that you could dial all the way up and get tons of gain, right? Then it had this limiter. So then you could limit how much volume came out of the amp, so you could literally just play with all this gain. And so when I was told, hey, pick out something at the shop with your credit, and then we'll hit the road. We're out of here. Drive back to Virginia. And I saw that amp, and I didn't even need to play through it. I just said, give me that amp, right? And so we loaded the amp up in the work van that we drove back. And, man, I get back, to Virginia, my little garage, and I've got this amazing golden amplifier. It says Boogie on it. And, it was like a legendary brand that, was never saw an amp like that in Virginia. Nobody had boogies. Nobody had a 412 Boogie 100. This was a 100-watt head. And all of a sudden I had gain for days, right? It wasn't long after that I figured a deal out to get a Kramer guitar with a Floyd Rose, and all of a sudden, man, I had all this gain at my fingertips. I had this magical amplifier. I had this Floyd Rose, and that very thing, that momentum of that moment, literally was the thing that catapulted me into a few different garage bands that started playing around, and then eventually playing a top 40 gig down by the beach. And of course, I used it occasionally in my time, playing at Busch Gardens. And man, all of a sudden, dude, I was the rock dude. I had the Floyd Rose. I had all of this stuff. And I think about how magical that moment was. I think back, man, if I could experience that moment again. Kids these days playing through modelers and all that, they don't get that experience. They don't get that experience of playing that Mystic Den, the Mystic Den that we used to play in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And it was a beer-soaked, beer by the pitcher, college bar, packed with, cute girls and drunk bros. And I'm on stage with my Mesa Boogie SOB, and I got the gain cranked on it, and I'm shredding on this thing. I've got a tank top on to show my guns, and man, it was just a magical moment. Having gear and having somewhere where you can use it, right? I could go tomorrow and figure out a way, trade some gear or whatever, take a few bucks out of the bank, and I could buy that magical stack. I could buy a magical stack again, right? But you know what? I don't have a place to play it, right? But when you're young, when you've got the world all laid out before you for you to conquer, that's when you need this magical gear. Now, many, many decades later, when I was out on the road touring with a large country act, playing arenas, right? I did a similar thing. I assembled an amazing rig, and I was constantly putting different heads in it. But at one time I had a Friedman brown eye, and I had a snakeskin Weber cab, and I had a couple of other different heads. At one time I had a Bogner Goldfinger, and I had a Egnator, I think it was called a Vengeance. And then I had a Mesa Stiletto, and then before the Friedmans, I had Splawn. I had 2 different Splawn. I think they were competition amps. And man, these magical moments of going out in these arenas. And look, once I got out there, and once, then I had the amazing thing of ESP hooking me up. I had this amazing blue guitar with a Floyd Rose on it. And it was like, all of a sudden I was like, imagining being, that young kid. But I was in these arenas playing with a country act and starting out the show with dive bombs and squeals, just like I had heard Edward Van Halen do decades and decades before. Those magical moments of that magical gear. You can't get that from a modeler. That is the reality of it in today's world, where they want clean stages and they want everything safe and everything controlled. There's no longer the days of being able to reach back and dime that amplifier and hit that note and hold the guitar and point it at that cabinet and get that amazing feedback and then manipulating it with your whammy bar. Those were magical moments, man. Those were magical moments. And that testimony alone is the very reason why tube amps and silent stages and all that steal a lot of the magic that we experienced in our younger days. And I hope this message reaches young people out there to hear this, the glory days of having that magical amplifier that you would just plug in. Man, back then, we didn't use a ton of pedals. I didn't have a bunch of stuff on the floor to stomp on. What I had was an amp. I would reach back, turn those knobs up, crank the volume up. To hell with the sound, man. He would just have to deal with it. Now, weren't those the glory days? Weren't those the days when magic came from the stage? Now, these days, you don't need a crank stack to get magical guitar tones. This Friedman IR-D is a great way to get incredible tones without driving the wife absolutely crazy. You can use headphones. It's got a built-in boost, and you can record it just the same way that I did in this video. I plugged it straight into my Apollo Twin, added a little reverb in post, and I got magical guitar tones. Hit the link in the description if you'd like to get yourself one of these. It helps the channel out greatly. Thanks so much for watching.